Good evening, one and all. This is another episode of Two Docs and a Grunt. I am, at least for this evening, Doc Barry. I'm Doc number one. I'm a psychologist and psychoanalyst. I specialize in working with veterans and first responders fighting with post-traumatic stress disorder.
And I'm Nate Emery. 22 years in the Marine Corps. Did 12 years enlisted, 10 as an officer, and then since then, the last 10 years, been with a DoD as a contractor or as a government civilian, and working with these fellows to try to destigmatize PTSD and depression. And next up is Doc Fonseca.
All right, good evening, everyone, and once again, welcome to Two Docs and a Grunt. As stated, I am Doc Luis Fonseca, Navy Corpsman, retired Navy Hospital Corpsman, spent 22 years on active duty, and I was involved in the Battle of Al-Nasiriyah, which subsequently got me awarded the Navy Cross for my actions. For tonight's guest, we have Mr. Ron Winters. Ronald Winters. He was joined the Marine Corps at the age of 18. He went to Parris Island for boot camp. From Parris Island, he went to Jacksonville for MOS school as an aviation's mechanic. He was after MOS school was transferred to HMM 161 for 1.5 years before he was deployed to Vietnam in the year of 1968. He flew over 300 missions as a door gunner and was awarded the combat action wings with 3 battle stars, which is very, very rare, especially 300 missions. So, Mr. Ron Winters, thank you for joining us. I do apologize that I got that other bio mixed up.
I bet it's somebody on Amazon that had an S on the name, didn't it?
Yes, now that I see it, you're absolutely right.
Oh,
It was
boy.
Ronald Winters and not Ronald Winter. So that is my fault to the guest.
Don't feel bad about that. That happens to me at least twice a week.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on board today. And before we started hitting record, we were talking quite a bit about the 300 missions as a door gunner in Vietnam. And since we're talking about that, why don't we start there, gentlemen, and go from there? How does that sound?
Perfect.
So, Ron, you said over 300 missions in 1968. And you said that you got your first battle star, your wings, and what else all in one day?
I got the wings with the 3 stars and my first air medal all in 2 days.
In 2 days, wow.
And to put that in perspective, in World War II, if you flew 39 combat missions in the European theater, you were eligible to go back to the States.
Wow.
So I flew 20 on the 1st and 2nd of June, 1968. And that was not unusual, not only in my unit. 161 was, we were unique because we went over as a unit with all brand new helicopters. We had the most recent version of the CH-46 Sea Knight, and for people to understand that, everybody knows what the Chinook is, that big double-rotored bird that flies around the 2-rotor. Well, the Sea Knight was like the smaller brother of the Chinook. In fact, there was a book out there, Dispatches, in which the author kept saying that he was flying around northern I Corps with Marine pilots that were flying Chinooks. No, the Chinooks were the Army, and the 46 was the Marine Corps. Mm-hmm. But people mistook them that because they both had the tandem rotors, as they call them, on the two on the top. But if you put them side by side, they look similar, but there's a lot of variations. Besides the fact Chinook's about twice the size of a 46, can carry twice the load, and you know right away because the engines on the Chinook are on the outside of the aft pylon, in the 46 they're on the inside, and there's other things like that. But anyway, we had brand new helicopters, the latest version, heavily trained people. We were all in that squadron for over a year in the States, and almost half the time that I was in New River, which is part of the Camp Lejeune complex, about half that time I was actually in schools there on the specific systems. And our commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Neeson, who was awarded the Marine Aviator of the Year when we came back from Vietnam for what we had done the previous year. He insisted that we all get cross trains in the other disciplines. So I learned all the electronics, all the electrical, and then went into hydraulics, electro-hydraulics, the airframes, the engines, the power plants. And he just wanted us to be as skilled in those helicopters as we could possibly be.
Yeah.
So when we landed in Vietnam, we were definitely ready to go. And we just, and there was another thing that happened at that time, was all the command north in northern I Corps was changed. We came under the command of General Raymond Davis, who was a Medal of Honor recipient from the Korean War. And at that time, prior to us being there, it was at the time of the McNamara line, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, which was an incredibly stupid idea by the late former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who thought that we could just build a fence across the DMZ. And
right.
the North Vietnamese would say, oh, gee, we can't go there anymore because they put up a fence. And it got a lot of people killed, and it was untenable and unworkable. When General Davis got there the same time we did, and he just, in one day, he turned the whole thing upside down. Everybody, prior, all the infantry had been on fixed bases. They'd been getting the living daylights bombed out of them from on the other side of the DMZ. He took, in one day, in the morning, he gathered all of his commanders, and he told them, you're getting out of those bases, you're going out on patrol. I don't want anything larger than a company left on a Con Thien might have been an area you guys might have heard about. That was one of the classics. But by what he did, he made the Marines be back mobile the way Marines are supposed to be. And we were there to move them around. So the amount of missions that we were flying they just went right through the roof. But we were there at the perfect time to do it.
Wow. So you gentlemen literally can say y'all basically hit the ground running. Yeah.
Yeah.
Y'all got there and got to work, huh?
Do you know which infantry battalions you supported when you were there?
Oh yeah, 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 9th. We went down to more out in the Arizona Anwad area down west of Da Nang. That was the 26th. Did I say
Wow.
the 5th? If they were there and on the ground, we moved them.
You flew everybody.
Yeah.
Man. And you said 26th Marines too?
26, yeah.
Man, so they got activated and
We were. They came out of Khe Sanh. I think Khe Sanh was the first time their entire regiment was together since World War II. But all three battalions of the 26th Marines were at Khe Sanh. One battalion of the 9th was up there, but after that they went into Operation Mead River, which was down by west of Da Nang, and we supported them there as well.
man, you guys were everywhere.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I
then
mean, they
Go ahead.
needed us everywhere, and there were a lot of challenges in that, but we managed to provide what they needed. We
Right.
set records for everything they kept statistics on. We set the records for them in the first 6 months we were in Vietnam.
That's something the aviation does keep a lot of statistics.
It does.
Hours,
Oh, do they?
weight. Yeah.
Oh, it makes
I've
sense because
got,
I mean,
after action reports here now that I've used in research for some of my writing, and yeah, it tells you they've got the coordinates that they went to, how many passengers, how many bullets we shot.
Yep. Gosh. You're going to say something, Luis?
yeah, I was gonna say. Well, I guess now thinking about it, it makes sense because every time I embarked on any airplane, especially going into country and a helo going into country, yeah, I mean, everything was so precisely accounted for to make sure that helo or that aircraft had enough fuel and just the right amount of fuel, right?
Yeah. Oh,
In order
yeah.
for you to be able to take more armament or more personnel, right?
Well,
So
remember,
now I understand that, yeah, how the aviation community would have such a detailed log of all that stuff.
we trained in the States, in North Carolina. And then you go out on the ocean, which is a different environment. Then we were flying in combat in Vietnam. which was much hotter, much higher humidity, and depending on where you were, we'd be, say at 10 o'clock in the morning, we'd be at sea level over by the ocean, and 20 minutes later we'd be in the mountains over by the Laotian border,
Right.
a mile high. And things change drastically.
Right,
And there's
right.
there's another reason for that. Number one, all the passengers, somewhere there's a manifest that said who they were. And as well, you had to know how much poundage they were carrying, because there were limits. And the other part of it is, if they crashed, then that's the only way you're going to know who
Right.
was in that aircraft, and a possible cause for it. The first thing they look, well, were they overweight? Did they have too many people? Did they have too much cargo? Whatever that. So there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's interesting when you go back and look at the archives to see all the details over there.
Yeah, a lot of the maintenance is based off of hours and weight too.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Those
Yeah.
what are they called? The load masters in the Air Force. Right?
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
they are strict. Like you do not mess around on their aircraft. Like
Oh no! In the Marine Corps and the Navy, you got crew chiefs, and it's the
Crew
same
chiefs,
thing.
that's what they're called. That's
If
what
it's
it is.
behind the cockpit, they are in charge,
Yeah.
and their word is law. And I don't care who's in there; it could be a 4-star general. And if
Yep.
that crew chief says you do this, they do it.
yeah.
Yep.
And you said your company or your battalion went from North Carolina to China Lake or Monterey.
No, we went to El Toro.
El Toro, that's right. And that was a 3-day fly over all of the United
Yep.
States in helos, huh?
Yeah.
Can you?
I went
expl-
across the Rocky Mountains in an open helicopter, and I used to smoke back then, which I don't now. But inside, we had these huge, like 250-gallon internal fuel tanks, and I spent most of my time. I was there as an avionics technician in case something went wrong on the flight, and nothing did. But I'd sit up on top of that thing and smoke a cigarette every so often.
Right.
And when we got up to on the going over the Rockies, the pilots called the crew chief and I up to the front and showed us there was a radar altimeter that showed you how far you were above the ground below you, and a barometric altimeter that showed you how high you were above sea level. Well, we were at 11,000 feet above sea level and 50 feet above the ground as we were
Wow.
going over this pass. And I went back and I was going to light a cigarette, and for the life of me, the oxygen was so thin I couldn't get my light to work. So there were some adventures there. That was, it was a record-setting thing that nobody could talk about because it was a troop movement. Nobody, the media didn't cover us or anything like that. None of that kind of thing happened. But it was quite an accomplishment. We were, and to this day, are very proud of having pulled that off. That was
Yeah.
a big deal.
It
And
sounds
were you
amazing.
guys? So was 161 the only medium squadron in country
Oh,
at the
no.
time? Or?
There was we were paired up with HMM 262 up in Quang Tri, and those guys bore the brunt of the resupply at Quezon during the siege. My hat is always off to the guys in 262 because they really did some remarkable stuff. Then down below us, a few maybe 30 miles or so down below was Fubai. And there was HMM 165 and I believe HMM 364. There was HMM 263. I think there were about at least six of the medium squads of the 46s. And then there were two more squadrons with the older UH-34s. Now the 46s were jet engines. The 34s were reciprocating engines. The 34s didn't last very long in the overall time. They were the ones that were used originally when the astronauts were splashing down in the Pacific and in the Atlantic when they did those, was where our space program was heating
Right.
up. Those were the guys who went out and pulled the capsules out of the ocean. There was 362, 363, and there might have been a couple of others. And if I missed them, I'm sorry.
I had no idea there were that many squadrons there at the same time.
Yeah,
Wow.
there was a lot. They were down in Marble Mountain, and we also had usually at least two squadrons out on ship, so they could
Man.
go up and down the coast, and then wherever they were needed, they'd be out there with a battalion of infantry, and they would usually have at least two of them. And I did that just before my tour ended. with two of the battalions of the 26, 326 and 226. And we had two squadrons, HMM 164, which was the one I hadn't mentioned. How could I forget that? I was in it. And we were out there on the Tripoli and the Valley Forge and the Okinawa. And we did operations off of them at various places up and down the coast.
Man. I just had no idea there were that many helos there at the same time. I'm still
in the Navy. I mean, compared to the Army, boy, when the Army came up to Fubai, I went down there one day on some business or another, and one of the guys I knew in one of the other outfits, HMM 165, said, "Hey, Winter, come on, take a walk over to the Army flight line." And we walked over, and there's just this sea, this ocean of helicopters, and like, wow. Because we had 24 per squadron, so we had 48 CH-46s in Quangtree, and then VMO-6 was up there with the Hueys and OV-10s,
and the Broncos
gunships, and then we had one partial squadron of heavy helicopters, the Sea Stallions, the CH-53. But I went down to Fubai and over to the Army flight line, and I was in awe. Where did they get all this equipment? Oh my God!
It makes you wonder was there anything left back in the States?
They were pumping them out pretty good. And I had a guy from 326. We did an operation called Bold Mariner down south of Chulai just before I came home, and we went in this peninsula from three sides, and on the end of it, the Marical Division was there as a blocking force. And one of the infantry guys I talked to from 326, he said, Ronnie, when we got up there to meet up with them, he said, I never saw so much armor in my whole life. He's like, they had more armor on that one operation than we had in the whole Marine Corps. I mean, the Army is just a whole different world than the Marines. It's big. It's really big.
Yeah, but I'm surprised they had a lot of armor there, because if I remember right, wasn't there only through the whole war really only one tank engagement?
Probably was, and he was talking more about APCs, armored personnel.
Oh, okay, like the old 113s.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Although
I got it.
They did have a tank for us at Quangtree when they got there, because we were still got there right in the middle of what they called mini Tet, which was after the Tet Offensive when the NVA and the Viet Cong just got slaughtered. The remnants of their units kind of got back together and reformed and tried to do something again, and they got slaughtered again. But since we were the furthest north helicopter base, air base of any kind, we were the brunt of their attacks coming across the DMZ. So we had a tank for a while that would sit there and shoot fire missions, which was always fun because they never told you when they were going to shoot. And they were about 50 yards tops from my hooch. So I mean, all of a sudden, just bam!
So
oh yeah,
they're using the tank kind of like self-propelled howitzers, but
yeah,
using a tank instead. That's interesting.
Okay.
yeah.
And I wonder why they did that, because I know the Marine Corps had we had like 8-inch guns on self-propelled howitzers all the way up into right after Desert Storm. So I was surprised to hear that they were using a tank.
Probably they had more tanks than artillery at that time, or I know they needed a lot of that artillery up along the DMZ. And then the further we went, the DMZ kind of got blocked off, and then they shifted everything over to the Laotian border and started coming in about 10 miles south of Quezon. And that was in my most recent book that I wrote, Victory Betrayed. That was Operation Dewey Canyon, and that was all to the Laotian border, and huge infiltration route there.
Yeah. Oh man! Now I got to read your books.
Yeah, right.
I've got an uncle who was a radio operator with 5th Marines, and that's all I know. I mean, when I was really little, I got him to show me some slides from when he was there, but of course, it's the pictures of the guys back in the back on the air base. The patrol base, stuff like that. But
well, that's the thing too. I have some pictures, and I did have an Instamatic camera with me. But the thing was, if you're shooting, you can't take.
Then you're not shooting.
So,
Yep.
so
Yep.
unless somebody designated a photographer to go on a particular flight, which occasionally they did, you really didn't get. I mean, I've got pictures of like down there's an explosion. Well, that was the jets prepping the zone for us to go in. But if
Yeah.
I'm going down there, I am not on the camera. I'm on a 50 caliber machine gun.
Right.
Yep. No, I hear you. I brought with me a little 110 camera. You know, those little tiny film things, and I did take pictures. Once the shooting had started, because I was riding on top of an Amtrak the whole war, and what I didn't know is that there was sand in there that was keeping the shutter open, so none of that film made it out. Yeah, I had a couple of waterproof disposable cameras. I think I had 2 of them, and that was the only film that made it out for me. And I was like, oh, okay, well maybe that was supposed to be that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I kick myself in the butt for not taking as many pictures as some of my other friends, because it was kind of that same thought process. It was like, I'm going to combat, like, I'd never been to combat in 2003, right? So all you see is movies, so you kind of think it's like that, like 24/7 shooting, right? So I'm like, I don't need a camera out there. There'll be some reporter out there probably. And so, yeah, out of all my deployments, I really don't have many pictures of all those deployments. I have to rely on other people that were there that took the pictures. So
You do the same thing I do. Whenever they post something, I go steal the picture.
Exactly.
I guess somebody finally posted a photo of us sleeping on the runway in Mogadishu, and I was beginning to believe that it didn't actually happen. We were talking about we're like, no, the planes would land, and they would be off the end of the runway, and then they would have to get the tug out there and turn it around, and the wings would go right over the top of us. And people were like, there's no way in hell. You guys would be FOD. And I'm like, no, I swear it happened. And someone finally posted a photo a couple of months ago, and I'm like, it did happen. Okay, I remember. But yeah, there's not nearly as many photos of the things that you should have taken, and probably more of the ones you shouldn't have.
We do regular reunions, and this part and parcel of coming back and coming home and all that stuff. But when I started working on my first book, it was an offshoot of, at that time I was a journalist. I worked at the Hartford Courant newspaper in Connecticut. And when the wall was being dedicated, they put out a notice in the company that said, we're looking for people to go cover the dedication of the wall in Washington, D.C. So everybody was scrambling because it was considered a plum assignment. And I just went to the Metro editor, a great guy named Dick Barnes, and I told him, I said, Dick, I want to go cover that. And he said, well, what's your reason? I said, I was there.
Right.
I have
Friends on the wall.
On the wall,
Yeah.
which nobody else here has. And he told me, he said, well, go back to your desk and write up, 3 or 4 vignettes for me about the people on the wall. So I did. And he read 5 minutes, and he just sent me a note, said, Ron, you're going to D.C. And it was a highly emotional experience. And I met some people that I'd known. I met a lot of people I hadn't known, didn't know. Got to start exchanging stories, started learning. And prior to that, to be honest with you, the media was full of such overwhelming BS about what Vietnam veterans were. And several years earlier, we at that time they were going off about us being the walking time bombs, and I was in an office, and there were several other reporters, and some guy had done something that was going to get him in the paper for not the right reasons, and he was claiming to be a Vietnam vet, and these reporters that I knew just started off on Vietnam vets and what a bunch of crumbs and bums and everything else they were, and I just stopped them finally after about 5. I said, you realize I'm a Vietnam veteran, right? And they're like, you? Well,
Yeah.
I didn't have long scraggly hair, and I wasn't wearing my camis to the office every day, and I wasn't on drugs, and I did and still do like beer and scotch, but I didn't drink it at 6 o'clock in the morning. and they couldn't believe it, and that was the environment at that time, and it was constant that we lost the war, and the reason that out of the 4 books, 2 of them are nonfiction on Vietnam is I came from a pretty tough little town in upstate New York, and you didn't go around saying you kicked somebody's ass if you didn't kick their ass, because if you said you kicked their ass and they heard about it and you hadn't, they're going to come kick your ass.
And they're going to give you the opportunity to try.
There you go. And what I learned from going to cover the wall was meeting guys from the Army, guys from the Navy, guys from the Air Force, and people starting to put pieces of the story together. And that was the first time I heard, and it's true, that in the entirety of the 15 years that American forces were there, we never lost a single major battle in that whole war. And people had been in the media with these fantastic stories of post-traumatic stress and these blackouts and flashbacks. And I, from 1975 till 19 84, I thought I had a real candy-ass tour in the war. Now here, the fact, my 300 missions, there were guys in my unit that flew 600, 900, and a very close friend of mine who has since died, but at that time, he was one of 2 people, one pilot who at the time flew for 262, but later became a commanding officer of 161, and my friend Doug Brayman, both of them flew over 1,000 missions. In one tour, and this was phenomenal stuff, and other guys in other units were doing the same thing, but I thought, boy, these guys are getting in the paper. There was a guy in Connecticut that claimed to a reporter in the Hartford Courant that he had been in such horrendous combat that he had these constant flashbacks. And he'd get up in the middle of the night and he'd be hiding down in the plants in his living room, and he'd be taking out his combat knife. And the first thing I thought was, well, if you're doing that crap, why do you have a combat knife? Get it out of your house, Dumbo. And then this guy made the claim that he blacked out one night and he swam across the Connecticut River up at this place called East Haddam, where there's a bridge, which also has very strong currents there, with his knife in his mouth. And at the time, I had no reason to doubt these people.
Yeah.
Like, wow, boy, I really had it easy. I mean, all those, the rocket attacks and the people shooting at us. And the whole time I was there in those 300 missions, we took airbursts below Quezon from artillery over by Laos, command detonated mines, automatic weapons of all kinds you can imagine, mortars in the zone that came down on either side of our helicopter as we were lifting off, and took out half of the squad that we had just put in there and rattled us back and forth. Bullets by the hundreds and thousands, and I'm thinking all along, boy, that's nothing. These guys must have really had it bad, because I'm not doing that. I don't have weird things going on in my life like that. And I thought, boy, I really feel bad for them guys. And it wasn't until later that I learned that a lot of them weren't all what they claimed to be. And that came out when I was researching John Kerry's Winter Soldier event in 1993, in which he had 140 people testify to atrocities against the Vietnamese. And when the NCIS people, I don't know if they called it NCIS at the time, but naval investigators took all those names and went and interviewed every single one of them. And out of that 140 people, only one person had been in Vietnam doing what he said he did, where he said he did it, in terms of that's where he was stationed. And he would not interview on the record to all his claims of the atrocity. 139 out of 140 people were lying.
So he had surrounded himself with a bunch of other people that were making up stories as well.
Yep.
I knew that about Lurch. I just didn't realize that he had surrounded himself with a bunch of others too.
That whole thing was a pure fantasy land. And they hadn't been in Vietnam, or they hadn't been where they said they were. They weren't in the unit or MOS they claimed to be, or in many cases they weren't even ever in the service.
Right.
And so when I was a kid, I used to subscribe to Vietnam Magazine because I loved history,
I wrote
and then all my second cousins and my uncles had been in Vietnam, and I remember reading through there, and I don't know if it was one of the issues, it was in the 90s, but in one of them they started adding up all the people who claimed to be Vietnam veterans and had been in combat, and there was something, I think the numbers were like 3 times the number of people claimed to be combat vets that were actually than the number they knew actually to have been on the ground. It was huge.
It was a census thing, I believe, and it was something like 13 million people claimed to be Vietnam veterans, but only 2.5 million of us were actually in country, and another 500,000 were in the theater. And
Wow.
only 9 million were in the service in that whole period of time.
Out of 10 years.
And I thought, boy, I guess we've arrived. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody wants to be us now.
That's you brought up something I hadn't thought of. Like everybody's heard the term stolen valor, but I mean, the way we think of it is okay, they're stealing the spotlight, but really the worst part of it is it diminishes what actually happened with people who were there for real, Like to the extent that you even started to question, what you went through, and you're like, oh, well, I didn't have it nearly as bad as these other guys. Well, these other
Right.
guys were making up stories.
Well, then you have to
Man.
also take into account too how many of those people have made up stories just to get into the VA system, which has
Yeah. Yeah.
not helped us out at all whatsoever. Right? It's backlogged the VA system for decades. It's just added more fuel to the fire. It's when people talk about why my disability hasn't been routed through yet, and it's been 7-8 months, is because the VA is still trying to sort out through a lot of people that have bottlenecked it
Yeah.
by
That's true.
by either stolen valor or not even that, right? Even some service members that will exaggerate on their service in order to try to get bigger compensation or whatever you want to call it, right? And it bottlenecks the system. So
I have a really interesting story. We were talking before we started the show about veteran suicides, and after I left the second paper I worked for up in Connecticut, the Journal Inquirer, which was a great paper and a great place to work, I got a call from an editor, a good friend of mine, and she told me that in one of the small cities that they covered, there was a place where this group of guys was gathering in a vacant lot every day, and it was next to a package store, which is a liquor store in Connecticut, and getting their daily dosage and going out and sitting out in the weeds and drinking whatever they were drinking. And so she sent a reporter over. A reporter asked her if she could go interview these people and see what their deal was, and she did. And her preliminary was that they were all Vietnam veterans suffering from various afflictions. And she called me, and we'd been very good colleagues over the years that I was there. And she said, "Hey, Ron, I got this reporter doing this. I just want to, can you give me any tips, anything we should look for?" And I said, "Yeah, tell the reporter to ask every single one of those guys for a DD-214." And she said, "Well, what's a DD-214?" I said, "Department of Defense Form 214. I said, "When you get discharged, everybody that's been in, if it's 1 day or 100 years, you get a DD-214 when you're discharged. It tells when you were in, where you were in, the conditions of your service." I said, in my case, it's got some of my medals listed, not the ones that came out afterwards, but I said it'll tell you where they've been, what they did for a job in the service, which branch of the service, what their rank was, all this stuff. I said it's a one-page walking encyclopedia of who that person is. Well, the
Yeah.
reporter went back to that group and said, "Okay, my editor says I can go ahead and interview you guys and do this story, but first I got to get your DD-214s. So can I come over tomorrow and you guys give me your..." Not one had a DD-214.
yeah.
And that was exactly the reason you were talking about, Luis, that they were looking to get benefits, cheap benefits. We get in the system. I mean, there's guys I've known out there that give like cottage industry classes on how to handle yourself when you're getting interviewed for PTSD.
Right. Yeah.
And people over the years have asked me, "Why didn't you ever put in for PTSD?" Because I know guys who have it really bad and have had some horrible things happening to them, and that didn't happen to me. And I am very fortunate.
Yeah.
And I am not going to go out there and step on those guys' toes, or try to pick up. I mean, yeah, I mean you get money, but I just I guess I got a little bit more
Integrity.
integrity. Thank you, probably the
Yeah.
best word for it. I just couldn't do that. I know I'd be conning the system,
Yeah.
and I don't want
Yeah.
to.
And I
Let me-
think,
let me-
and don't get me wrong, I don't want to offend anyone that might be listening or view it later, but I personally feel that sometimes it's the non-combat people that are trying to, I don't want to say scam the system, but maybe try to get a leg up on the system. Because I remember when I was retired, everyone was telling me the same thing, Luis, you're gonna get 100%. If you don't get 100%, you're a fool. And I'm like, and I would tell them like, if I get 100% or not, as long as the findings, the evidence, match the percentage, that's all that matters to me. I said, I got buddies, double amputees, that still can't get 100%, permanent and total disabled. They're like at 70 or 80%, and I'm like, I kind of like you said, Ron, like maybe my integrity is a little bit different than some, but like no, like that's, and I'm part of a different Facebook groups that deal with the Veteran Association. And you should see how many times a day someone will get on there like, oh, I got my rating today at 70%. Someone tell me the tricks to make it go up to 100%. And it's two sides of the story. Like you'll have some of us that are like, no, you're wrong. If that's what they gave you and the evidence found that is what you get, that's what you get. And then some people are like, no, we deserve every penny that we can get. And I'm just like, you know what? Whatever. I can go on my soapbox about that for hours, but we won't. This is your show, Ronald.
I wanted to ask you.
I had a friend that. I'm sorry, Doc. You were saying something.
Yeah, go ahead, Doc.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've been. I usually don't talk much. I just want to throw in a question or two. Where in upstate New York did you grow up, Ron?
I was born in Troy, and I
10
lived
miles
the
away
first
from
10
here.
years of My
Yep.
life. Where are you, Doc?
Schenectady.
Oh God, yeah. My best friend worked over there at GE, and my uncle worked at GE.
Mm.
But yeah, I lived on my grandfather's farm in Center Brunswick till I was 10, and then we moved off the farm. My aunt and uncle bought it. My uncle that worked at GE bought my grandfather's farm. Grandpa got too old to work it, and Dad was kind of wishy-washy about taking it over, so my Uncle Floyd did, and we moved into the town of Wynantskill. I don't know if you've been through there, but
Oh yeah.
and
How
that's
many
I was there. Pardon me.
Go ahead. Finish what you're saying.
I was there till I was 18, and I had those merit scholarships that they're talking about on the news these days. Well, yeah, okay. Well, I actually got one of them.
Wow.
In to Albany State, and I went there for the first semester, but my mom had put me into kindergarten when I was 4, which really was not a very good move at all. So I was in college when I was 17, and I had no idea what on earth I wanted to do with my life. And everybody was telling me, you got to decide. And
Right.
I want to get old enough to drink beer legally. That's what I want to do.
So you were.
It didn't work out, and I was in really, I guess the right word would almost a hostile relationship with my father. And the scholarship I had paid all my books and costs and fees and everything, but not room and board. And at the time, the University of Albany was a semester away from opening up the big campus that's there today. At the time, it was spread out over Albany, and the living conditions were very different. So I commuted, which made it unbelievably difficult from Wynantskill to Albany every morning to be there for an 8 o'clock class. When I had to take the bus, that was incredible. So after one semester, I went and talked to the dean, but that was the day after my 18th birthday, which I went down to the recruiting station in Troy and signed up. And then went home that night, my father unsigned me. And I went down the next day and signed up again. But anyway, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever, I am who I am what I am, and I did what I did. The dean told me that whoever scheduled my classes for that semester must have been a sadist, because I had an 8 o'clock in the morning class 3 days a week, and on that same day I also had to be there for a 4 o'clock in the afternoon class. So my days were extraordinarily long. And I had a math class at 8 o'clock, and the teacher was a real SOB. And there were times when I ran 6 or 7 blocks full out to get to that class. And if the second hand went past 8 o'clock, in 001, he'd just get all over my case and tell me get the hell out of my class. Yeah, he made it miserable. So I withdrew and I went to Paris Island.
I did the last 2 years of my bachelor's degree at SUNY Albany. It was after
right?
Yep. It was after the main campus, as you described it, was built. And I didn't have much fun there either, let's put it that way. Yeah, I had tenured experts in the psych faculty telling me that I'd never make it in psychology and it wasn't for me, and well, kiss off. Anyway, what I wanted to ask is, if it's okay to ask, how many friends do you have on the wall?
24.
Yeah. And it's what you bring up about how the Vietnam vets were portrayed in the media. The only thing I can say is I was 12 years old when it ended in 1975, and I was exposed to that media that you are talking about. And needlessly, that what I was reading in the magazines and the newspapers for a while made me afraid of Vietnam veterans.
Yeah. And they were supposed to. Yep.
So I thought I'd just throw that in there. They created monsters when there really were none.
Right.
And
my first marriage, Vietnam was not allowed to be talked about. My medals, such as they were that I came home with, were hidden away. After I got divorced, my oldest daughter, when she came to my house, every so often she'd sneak a medal out and bring it to me. And it was that. It was so I made a point of telling my son and daughter what it had been really like, and from there, and that's actually after that whole thing with the wall, that's when I started researching 161 and what became Masters of the Art, because what I got out of going down to cover the dedication at the wall, and then 2 years later the dedication of the three, what they call it now, the 3 servicemen, used to be the 3 fighting.
3 grunts.
3 grunts. There you go. When I went down to cover that dedication, it just expanded it, and that's why I've started learning all these things and meeting people who were in a position to know these facts, and then I start finding out not only did we never lose a battle, but we wiped their army out twice over. We annihilated the Viet Cong in the Tet Offensive, and what scraps were left. On those first 2 days, when I told you when I got my first air medal in my wings, the first guy that shot at me was a Viet Cong, and he missed. And that was his unfortunate.
His last miss.
Yeah. And that's the only Viet Cong I ever saw. And I talked to the guys in the 4th and the 9th and the 1st and all the rest of them were. And mid 68, I said, yeah, I never saw any Viet Cong. Never saw any Viet Cong. They said they had them down near south of Chu Lai, where it was like a hotbed of, where it all first started and everything. But that operation we did with the Americal division, they expected to kill 3,000 to 4,000 Viet Cong, because that was supposed to be the last remaining area. And I think the total out of that operation was more like 600. So there was all this speculation. Well, did they manage to infiltrate, exfiltrate through the Americal? But the Americal said, man, we had that place sealed. I think that they got that because that's all that was there. I think they had grossly overestimated the number of people, that were in that area, because they got mauled. I mean, I read in other guys' research, it said they put out 75,000 Viet Cong troops in the Tet Offensive, and 40,000 of them were killed. Not casualties, were killed.
You know, wouldn't I don't know how long it went on, but when you say that some of that probably the numbers got skewed and inflated back when they were actually trying to keep track of how many bodies there were, and it was when you're a grunt, and if the inflating numbers is going to help make things easier for you when you get back, maybe give you some more R&R or barbecue or something.
Yeah.
There were some disincentives that they hadn't thought about, I think. But I wonder how much of that was because of that. Everybody's idea of how many the numbers were so much bigger.
Right.
Two things I can tell you, and it's important to know both of them. In Operation Dewey Canyon, we put the entire 9th Marine Regiment over in this area of operations that pushed right up to the Laotian border. And then 2-9, the 2nd Battalion, went across the border for a week and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In that operation, on Tet of 1969, which happened later in February, just like Tet was last week this year because of the lunar cycle, a 200-man infantry and sapper unit attacked Firebase Cunningham, which was the headquarters for the whole 9th Marine Regiment in this operation. And it was just bristling with artillery. 100 sappers, 100 infantry. Came in at about 2 o'clock in the morning, breached the wire with Bangalore torpedoes and other explosives for about 30 seconds. And then the whole base just erupted fighting off. Well, they continued to fight until daylight. And they believe, with good reason, that most of that 200 died. But there were only 37 intact bodies inside the base or on the wire. Now, Colonel Harvey Barnum, retired Colonel Medal of Honor recipient, was on.
I know him.
He was a captain at the time. He was in charge of one of the artillery battles. They were firing the beehive rounds, which are just loaded with flechettes, little darts, 1,000 of them.
Yep.
And when they
Shredded
fire,
wheat.
they hit everybody, just get down, and they shoot over their heads, and they would tear everything apart. And he told me, he said, Ron, there were body parts all over the perimeter, but they couldn't count any of them as being a dead enemy combatant because it wasn't an intact body, which was one of the stupid things. Now, further on in that operation, they were attacking a hill called Tambui it was all honeycombed. They'd been in there. It was solid rock that they had these tunnels through, and they've been in there for, I don't know, decades or more.
Since the French.
And they were having a really tough time getting up there, and it was very similar to Hamburger Hill, which happened 2 months later. But what worked out for the Marines is that they decided to pull back and bring air in on top of that hill. And so these guys had just fought and gained 1,000 yards, and now all of a sudden they're being told, go back, and they're like, what? Well, the thing of it was, the air liaison got one aircraft to come in and bomb that hill. But that one aircraft was a B-52 with a full load of bombs.
Oh, wow.
85 500-pound bombs on
Man.
top of this hill. So when they went up there, as the colonel told me, not Colonel Barnum, but the colonel was in charge of it, Colonel Weedham, he said, yeah, it was significantly less resistance to get that. And these are the things that happen, but it's the same thing. They weren't allowed to say how many dead combatants. Have you ever seen what happens to a regiment out in the open when a B-52 strike hits it? There's vapor.
Yeah, you become part of the environment.
Yes, you do. And this is part of the stupid. But the number two, when it was all said and done, and I hear guys, they really love to just focus in on it. Well, while you were there, they said this many or this many. At the end of the day, in 1995, North Vietnamese, or Vietnam as it is now, admitted that of their regular troops, they lost 1.5 million.
Wow.
So I don't care on any particular battlefield, in any particular skirmish or whatever it was, what the numbers may or may not have been. At the end of the day, they lost 1.5 million troops, which was more than 2.5 times, or about 2.5 times, the standing army that they had in the mid-60s. And that's not counting the Viet Cong. I have been under the impression for a number of years that approximately 250, 275,000 Viet Cong were killed. But a guy read my book here last year, Victory Betrayed, and he got really interested in it. And he was a teenager when the war ended, and he's been very, very interested. He's a local policeman, great guy. Really got to be good friends with him. And he called me up one day about a month and a half after, and he said, you know, Ron, I went looking for more information on that subject. He said, because I had never heard any of this stuff. He said, I just found a couple places, and he said, I'm cross-referencing, but they all say the same thing. They're saying that the Viet Cong lost 600,000 troops in Vietnam. So the enormity of the loss, and you know, here's one of the things that I've come to conclude because of my disdain for the media that I once worked for. I think an awful lot of people in the media are far, far left. I think a lot of people in the media are communists, but I don't think they know what it really means to be a communist, because it's kind of like a limousine liberal. Yes, I'll be a communist in a free, not just in any free world country, but in the United States of America. And then I can sit around and talk and say things and sound intellectual. But what really I think is they didn't want the world to know how many troops, how many people the communist leaders were willing to sacrifice to get their goals. If we had lost anything, that's more than 20 to 1 compared to what we lost in Vietnam. And if we had lost anything near that, any portion of that, this country would have gone berserk. Then they never told you that they had anti-war protests in North Vietnam. It didn't last very long, any more than the ones in Russia a couple months ago. They didn't tell you about the desertion rate coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was monumental, but it didn't help because they didn't have any place to go except back to their family homes, and they'd get arrested there. And they tell them, you're going down there, and if you don't, we're just going to take out your family.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are things that matter, because I believe this shows the difference between communism and free world. And I don't want to say capitalism, because I'm not talking about money here. I'm just talking about a free world, a democratic society. They will take any losses to whatever degree they need to. And Putin is showing this over there fighting in Ukraine right now, where they're getting slammed, but he isn't stopping. Because in their mindset, the individual is irrelevant, the state is everything and all powerful, and if we got to get 1.5 million of you killed until these guys get tired enough of seeing stuff in the papers that we put in there to make them look bad, until they capitulate, then that's what we'll do. Because it wasn't the leaders at the top that were getting bombed and getting killed and getting maimed and all these other things. It was just the average working people, and they had no say in it. And I think that is, more than anything, the clearest example of the difference in our system of government and our belief in the rights of the individual as opposed to the supremacy of the state. And I think that's one of the reasons the media doesn't cover that, because I think they're just so darn left, they just can't even come to terms with the fact that they could be that ruthless.
And so...
Yeah, that's a...
Oh,
go ahead,
Nate.
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's like, I guess, the body count that they would have had on top of what, China and the Soviet Union already had, that's just going to, I guess that just would have been too far for them, I guess.
Well,
but like you said, Putin, is amping those numbers up now.
Toward the end of Reagan's administration, the Chinese came out, the communist Chinese came out and admitted they'd sent 300,000 troops down to Vietnam. They admitted to losing 30,000 of them, but frankly, I think it was probably a heck of a lot more than that. And we know, and I have it in Victory Betrayed, we know that there were Russian troops fighting against us in the south, because in Dewey Canyon, they managed to knock out a Russian 122 millimeter artillery battery, and they knocked it out before the troops that were manning it could leave. And they found 15 dead Russians and all this material, the supporting material in Cyrillic writing there.
Well, that's what we call advisors, right?
Yeah, advisors.
Yeah.
They advise you to duck.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you, those big guns, and one of them is still in front of the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico. They captured 2 guns intact. They hadn't had time to spike them. And they brought them back. One of them, they believe, according to one of the guys I talked to, it may have ended up in Afghanistan shooting against the Russians when the Russians were there in the 80s.
Wow.
And the other one went to the Marine Corps, where is now the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, and it's still there out front.
Man. Those are big mortars.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I was surprised when the Marine Corps brought them back
Yeah.
briefly.
so question for you gentlemen, educate myself. So what was the difference? I always thought we were always fighting the Viet Cong, but Ron, you said something about the standing army was one, and then the Viet Cong was another. Can you educate me a little bit on that, please?
The Viet Cong were Southern guerrillas. Here's what happened. One of the things the anti-war people used to harp on back in the 60s and 70s was that there was supposed to be an election in the 1950s.
Okay.
There had been a meeting in Geneva. They agreed to split the North and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel, roughly, and then there was supposed to be an election, and everybody was going to get to vote on whether they wanted to be communist or democratic. Well, South Vietnam and the United States pulled out of that election in 1956, and everybody on the other side said, see, they didn't want it. Well, the reason they did was because there was a period of time when anybody who wanted to go from one place to the other could do so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a couple, maybe 30 or 40,000 people in the South started north because they wanted to live in a communist country, and 2 million people were headed south. 3 million people total. A million people got across the DMZ to the south, and they shut it down. There were 2 million people, and it's the same thing they did in Berlin, the same thing they did with the Iron Curtain in Germany, all across Europe. They did the same thing. They shut it down. There were 2 million people that were not allowed to come south. And so the United States and South Vietnam said, you either open up the border or we're not going to hold an election. So, and why would they? How stupid can we be? These days we probably would have done it, but back in those days there was a little more common sense and people understood a little bit more about communism. But so anyway, it went about maybe only a year or two where there was supposed to be, nothing going on. There was a demilitarized zone, nobody's supposed to cross it, blah, blah, blah. They infiltrated cadre from the north, and they started building up the Viet Cong with their old Viet Minh people, the ones that had fought the French. And that's where they came up with this myth of the guy in the pajamas with the old French rifles and all that stuff. Well, originally there were some, but they kept, just infiltrating and they were brutal about going out to these villages and just taking people. And one of the things I read about, and I think it was in Time magazine, I could be wrong about that, but there was an article about this leader of the village woke up one morning, and the villagers were all coming out to go do their work on the rice paddies, and the leader's standing there with his wife, and they're under they got Viet Cong guards there, holding guns on them, and they had made them dig a ditch, and they brought out their children, and they eviscerated their children right in front of the parents, cut their stomachs across like Harry Carey. And threw these screaming children into the ditch and buried them alive in front of their parents. And then they killed their parents. And that's how that was a recruitment drive in that unit. And they went down and conscripted hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese. And many of them, there were people there that were on the communist side to begin with, but that didn't last a long time, and ultimately they had, I don't know how many people they actually had in there, but they were essentially guerrilla fighters. They were small unit tactics. It was mines and booby traps, that kind of thing, infiltrating. And then they took some of them as they built up the size of them and turned them into hardcore, but they were still guerrillas. They weren't conventional warriors. Then North Vietnam had the entire conventional, the machine guns, the mortars, the planes, the tanks. All the conventional army stuff. They were the conventional army. And what happened was that Viet Cong could hold their own against the South Vietnamese, because South Vietnam didn't really have much of a military to begin with. If you go from the mid to the late 50s and into the early 60s, the communists were doing better than the South Vietnamese. But then when we started coming in to help them, we actually did send advisors in and started to show them how to put their things, their units together, how to do tactics. And then we started sending our own people in. You know, they dated from 1965, but we had over 100,000 people there well before that Tonkin
Right,
Gulf
right,
incident. And then they were losing the Viet Cong at a rate that they couldn't sustain. They couldn't replace them. So the North Vietnamese had been there all along in small numbers. Then they started coming down in the big numbers. And by when 1968, when Tet was over, there were no more Viet Cong. So all that fighting from 1968, mid 68 onwards, it was North Viet. It was conventional army against conventional army.
Oh, okay.
NVA.
Yeah. So that being one of the reasons why it always ticked me off when some dimwit called us a baby killer, because the only babies I saw were people that we were rescuing out of the villages that they had attacked and getting them back to safety. And the only people I fought were people that are every bit as well armed as I was.
Yeah.
So that was the difference. It was, and this is another little thing a lot of people don't know. After Saigon fell in April 1965, sometime there in May, the North Vietnamese held themselves a military parade down through the streets of Saigon to say, look, here we are, we're the victors, blah, blah, blah. They did not let anybody representing any Viet Cong unit march in that parade. They put a bunch of them together at the end of one of their units, but they couldn't carry any unit insignia, any flags, Viet Cong flags, nothing. And they did have one representative from the Viet Cong on the reviewing stand, all the way in the back, off in the corner. It's like, you know, the backseaters in Congress kind of thing. And they did not recognize the Viet Cong at all.
Wow.
Because as far as they were concerned, the Viet Cong had failed them. Because in 68, the uprising that was later termed the Tet Offensive, the people of South Vietnam were supposed to rise up with the Viet Cong and attack us. But the people of South Vietnam were very happy that we were there for the most part, and they didn't come out to play. So the whole thing was a major fiasco until Walter Cronkite went over there in April and said that it had been a stalemate. He actually said it had been a stalemate when we wiped out the entire attacking force.
Right.
Speaking of the media.
And so, speaking of the media, that leads me into my second question. What made you get into journalism after your service in the Marine Corps?
Necessity. When I came back, I got married and it was a mistake. I mean, I got married real quick. I hadn't planned on it. I just got told, okay, here's the wedding date. And before I got out of the Marine Corps, I was also told, you're going to be a daddy. And I would have been better off by many, many ways to have stayed in the Marine Corps. I had a necessary MOS. They were going to give me a lot of money to stay in. And I would have been a Sergeant E5 and on the list for Staff Sergeant. I would have done very well. I made a mistake. I ended up working at Pratt & Whitney Aircraft in East Hartford, Connecticut. Now, I came from being a skilled technician on some of the most advanced avionics that you're going to find in the modern aircraft at that time, modern military aircraft. Some of the jets had stuff that we didn't need, but we had everything else. I went from being really known and appreciated for my troubleshooting abilities. I was good at what I did, and I flew a lot. Not only did I fly gunner, but I flew on test flights in the co-pilot seat. And it was something that brought the plane down. We had to fix it, and you couldn't write it off as being airworthy again till it was tested in the air. And I flew on tons of those flights.
Yeah.
So I was highly skilled. Let's put it this way: the job that Pratt & Whitney gave me was, in the morning I'd go in and I'd get a list of instruments that had to be taken to these various test cells around where they had engines, locked up there, and they would test them. And I would take the instrument or the device, whatever it was, to this test cell and put it down. And then I would mark down on this card that I had put it down. and then I would walk back and get another test card and to take another piece of equipment to another test cell and mark down that I had put it there. And at the end of the day, now I wasn't allowed to plug them in. I couldn't run them. I was in an experimental lab where there were guys at the other end of the lab, the labor grade 1 guys, who had been in that lab longer than I had been alive, and they were working on old tube stuff. We had been
Vacuum tube?
vacuum tubes.
Oh my gosh.
We had been trained in resistors and transistors and all the electronic stuff, and we were just getting the first equipment that was coming out with chips at that time. These guys actually looked down on us as though somehow they were just so smart.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I was allowed to take all the wires that were used to hook up the equipment, plug one side into an engine, plug the other side into the test box. I could wrap them up and carry them into this crib and hang them on the wall. And that was my freaking job for almost 2 years.
Did
And
that
it was
job-
demeaning beyond anything you... Pardon me?
The way you're framing it, Ron, I gotta ask you, did that job come with at least 1 or 2 bottles of no-dose every day? Unbelievable.
Well, you know what they did, and I'll give this to Pratt and Whitney. On the chow line, they had, you could go down and they had a cafeteria in there, and they had Pabst Blue Ribbon. And you could get 2 Pabst Blue Ribbons on your lunch. But there was a lot of guys that didn't go inside of the chow line. They ran across the street, and when the lunch bell rang, then they, boom. And there were like 5 or 6 bars across there and a couple of package stores. And those guys would run in, and the bars were just lined with shots and beer, shots and beer, shots and beer, shots and beer. And these guys had a half an hour to get in there, and they had real fast sandwiches. They hooked down a shot of beer, hooked down another shot of beer. And then they'd run next door to the package store and grab, a half pint or something like that, stick it in their pocket. And, I mean, that's what the guys did. And, Doc, what you brought up it's right on the money. I mean, my God. Do you know that... Because there had been a strike about 5 years later and there was a lot of bitterness, you couldn't have a coffee. So there was no coffee break. That was taken out of the union contract. So there was a place that's still there. It's called Augie and Ray's on Main Street in East Hartford. And it's a fast burgers and, chili dogs and coffee and fries and onion rings, all the good stuff, So a guy would get a job order to go to one of the off-site buildings every morning. And he'd take a truck, and he'd drive over to the other thing and do it, and then he'd hit Augie and Ray's on the way back with these big orders for all this coffee. And he'd bring all this coffee in under a tarp on this little push cart, and here were grown men in their 40s and 50s would get their coffee, and they'd have to go around the corner like into the tool crib and sneak their coffee because it wasn't allowed. I mean...
That's some prison shit.
Anyway, so you want to know why I became a journalist. So because it was such horror, I immediately signed up for school, but the only background I had was in electronics. So I had a wife who just, you've got to make money for me and you have to do something. And if you want to go to school, you do it on your own time. So for 2 years, I went to Hartford State Technical College, barely made it through, got an associate's degree in electrical engineering, but this was on a trimester system. Instead of 16 weeks for a semester, it was 11 weeks, 3 trimesters, but all my classes were 5 days a week. So instead of having 48 hours at the end of a semester, I had 55 hours classroom instruction at the end of a trimester, which meant, and then I got on the third shift, so I went in, I got up at 11 o'clock at night, punched in at midnight, punched out at 7, which was the only good thing going. I got that 1 hour differential. Had to be in school by 8, and most days didn't get out until 4. And I did that for 2 years until I got my associate's degree. And then I went to work. I took a year off and went to work in another place. I'd gotten laid off at Pratt & Whitney when the war started winding down. And I went to work in another defense industry and realized, boy, this is nowhere near as much fun as flying around in a helicopter shooting people. What the heck am I doing?
You said that last part out loud.
Right.
I realized that it wasn't I really liked having the status that came with being very good at my job in the Marine Corps. The pilots appreciated you, the crew chiefs appreciated you. People would come and ask for you to work on their aircraft, stuff like that. And just as an aside, crew chiefs used to come and ask me to fly gunner on their aircraft, so I felt pretty good about that too. And there was nothing to feel good about here.
Yeah.
You know,
You're no longer being recognized for your expertise and achievements.
And the interesting thing was when I worked out in that experimental lab, wrapping cables and carrying stuff, you know, every once in a while an engineer would come in to discuss something with one of the foremen or something. He's, you know, here comes a guy. He's coming in all dressed up. He's got a tie, not necessarily a jacket, but he's got a tie and shirts. You know, well, they all look really, you know, wow, man, you know, I got to get the heck out of here. That's where I want to be. And then one day they sent me into the engineering department. They asked something to one of the engineers. I looked in, there's a sea of guys, and they all looked the exact same. And I was like, well, you know what? It really isn't anything better on this side of the door either.
Yeah.
So I worked a year in electronics as a junior engineer. And I just, this is crazy. I don't want to be here. I was getting up every morning with my stomach tied in knots, and that had been the case for the past 3 years anyway. I said, there's got to be more to life. And I went back in the Marines. I signed up for an officer program and committed to 2 years and went to OCS and graduated in the honor platoon. Did extremely well down there. And in the meantime went back to school, and that was my job. I had to do things like being in the reserves, I guess is what it was. And then full time, you know, back on active duty for OCS. And when no longer was I being told, well, you have to get some. Well, I was still being told you can't just do anything. You have to do something that gives you a job. You have to have a job. And I said, yeah. Well, I said, I kind of thought about it. What do I like to do? Well, I like to read. I really like to read. I love to read. I still do. I always did. I learned to read when I was 4 years old, looking over my father's shoulder when he was teaching my older brother to read. I learned to read before my older brother, and I loved to read. I would read milk cartons and cereal boxes and the stuff on the back of cans before they had all the good stuff on there. You know, I just loved to read. And I said, I went down to the University of New Haven and enrolled in the engineering school, and they told me I'd had 2 courses in mathematics that were like prep math for the stuff that's coming after, 3 courses in calculus, advanced applied mathematics and differential equations, which is stuff where you're doing math that doesn't have numbers.
Right.
And I got it. I finally got it. I understood it. And I go down to the University of New Haven, and the head of the engineering department says, I'm going to take Calculus 1 all over. And I said, why? I've already had way beyond calculus. Well, we teach it differently here. And I said, well, do you get different answers?
Teach it different.
Wow.
And so they had 2 sessions, 2 summer sessions. And I was sitting at my kitchen table doing this calculus. And I read 3 pages of it, and I just like, screw this. And I got up and I went in my living room and picked up the Reader's Digest condensed books. And I sat down there and I read 2 stories. And I walked back out in the kitchen to take up on my math again, and I could remember everything about both of those stories, and I could remember a page of calculus, 1 page after I finished it. And I said, okay, this is dead wrong. So the next day I went down to school, and instead of going to the calculus class, I went to the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and I told him my plight. And he was so thrilled to have somebody actually want to take English that they gave me, the guy at the engineering said they were going to bring me in as a freshman. This guy said, I'll bring you in as a full junior if you come in the second session of the summer and take 1 course in British Lit and 1 course in American Lit. And I did, and I loved it. And the next 2 years, I really enjoyed college.
Nice.
And I ended up with a bachelor's degree in English. And so then I graduated, and I had been working at this fish and game club in southeastern Connecticut. It was a huge amount of land, very small number of members, and I was doing all this stuff. They had guys come up from New York City, and we guide them on fishing tours and then hunting. They had pheasants that we'd release, and actually it was kind of canned hunting, and I didn't really like that part. But I cut a lot of firewood. I learned how to use a chainsaw there. We planted a lot of wildlife sustaining grasses and things, and mostly it was a pretty enjoyable job. Didn't pay much. And what they gave me was they give me like an acre lot where I could go in and cut firewood. So I set my house up so I could burn firewood for fuel, and I'd get 4 or 5 cords of wood there, and then I'd sell a bunch more. So I actually was surviving okay, and I had just read Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond, and I was feeling pretty good about it because, hey, you know, I got the 4th thing. I had a roof over my head, clothes on my back, food in my stomach, and heat. I'm set. My ex-wife didn't think too much of that.
They don't like the grunt life.
Yeah.
And I had a huge garden. I mean, I grew a lot of stuff, and I still do. I still grow a garden. And anyway, the Hartford Current advertised that they were looking for a local correspondent to cover government meetings and do stuff like that. And that got stuffed right under my nose. So I called up and made an appointment and went up to Middletown, Connecticut, saw the bureau chief, and he basically told me, "You're not what I'm looking for," which pissed me off. He said, "I want a housewife. It's not going to give me any trouble. Just going to go to the Board of Ed meeting and write up what happened." And anyway, apparently nobody else applied for the job that was worth a damn, because the next day he called me up and said, "You still want it?" And that night I went to the Board of Education meeting, which just happened to be that night. And they were awarding the contract for the school buses, for the transportation. So they award the contract, and there's a group of people gets up all pissed off and stamps out. And well, I go out to ask them what's going on, and they told me the bidding process was rigged. So my first story for the newspaper was that
Controversy.
one bus company's claiming the other bus company, and the bureau chief's like, "What?" All I want to hear about was school lunches and little kids getting awards and stuff. So they kept me on. They thought that was pretty neat, and I actually found I had a penchant for reporting. And you know, there was a Vietnam element in it, because I realized very quickly that the town next to the one I lived in, which I ended up covering there as well, the lieutenant governor lived there, and he became the governor, Bill O'Neill. And I looked at that whole process, and I realized all those guys down in Washington that had made all those decisions between 71 and 75 that got all those people in Vietnam killed and all those people in Southeast Asia killed, started their careers right here in little places like this, on the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Town Council. And boy, that just set me into something. And then in my town, there was a schoolhouse that Nathan Hale had taught in before he got hung. And this was 1976, the bicentennial year. So everybody was bicentennial everything. So I did this story, in just a local story, talking about the lines of people that were coming to see the Nathan Hale Schoolhouse, because the State Department of Transportation had put signs up on the highways saying, you know, bicentennial site here. The only problem was they didn't check with the town, so the schoolhouse wasn't open and the people weren't ready for it.
Oh.
And so the bureau chief was like, "What?" So he did a little checking, and he found out there were places all over Connecticut where the Department of Transportation had put up signs telling people, "Come here for this bicentennial spectacle," and nobody could get in.
Yeah.
So that Sunday, I ended up on the front page of the Hartford Current, sharing a byline with the bureau chief, like a month and a half after I got hired. And 6 weeks later, I was a full-time reporter. And
Nice.
one thing led to another. I really did. I enjoyed it for a lot. I didn't like the politics in the media, and it's still there, and it still sucks. But I did like doing what I did. I became an investigative reporter. Got a lot of awards. Got nominated for a Pulitzer once.
Wow.
And it was okay. You know, it was okay. But the politics, the internal politics, weren't what I wanted. But it was an editor, a guy by the name of Jack Cadden, who recently retired from the New York Times, who was the city editor at the Hartford Current, that got me to write the story about covering the wall that ended up becoming the book Masters of the Art, that ended up with my wife and I putting together our first reunion, my first reunion of guys who went to Vietnam. Started at
Wow.
1988, and we are going to have what we're calling our Sunset Reunion this coming May over in Knoxville.
Nice.
So it's going
nice,
on all that.
nice. And question for you, just because I noticed it, it's going to totally throw us off track. Are you wearing a Corporal Chanawangsi t-shirt?
I didn't get that one. I'm sorry.
Are you wearing a Corporal Chanawangsi t-shirt? What's your USMC t-shirt? Is it just USMC? Oh, okay.
Yep.
There's
So we get a better here.
Yeah. There's
There you
a Marine corporal of mine that passed away in the Battle of Anazaria. He was my best friend at the time. His family makes shirts like that with the eagle, globe, and anchor, but then it has like the cross on the bottom with it says in memory of
really?
Corporal Chanawangsi. So that's all I was
Very
like,
interested in that.
yeah. And they're from Hartford,
I'm very
Connecticut
interested in that.
area.
If you can, send me a link to their website or whatever, because our
Definitely.
guys buy a lot of that stuff,
Okay.
and if we can help and support them. And it just as a side, in that same vein, I got an email 2 days ago, and I'm going to be answering it tomorrow. I just was taking orders stuff, but we were dealing in past reunions with a guy that does woodworking, and like your squadron patches and stuff like that, your unit patches, he could turn that into nice plaques. And we got a
Nice.
couple of them. We always have a silent auction at our reunion, and I got the nicest email, and at the bottom of it, I found out it was from his widow, and that the guy
Wow.
died a couple of years ago. And I had talked to him on the phone a number of times. It really quality work, and she's continuing to do the same thing.
Okay.
So, I'll be sending her an order to help him out. But I would absolutely love to get a link
Yeah.
to that website.
Okay, well, yeah, I'll
Absolutely.
send that over. But and another thing I was gonna say is the more and more I do these interviews and stuff, the more and more we do them, as well is I think the reoccurring theme is always the politics within whatever organization you're working in, because I always thought politics as far as government and in the military, but I've spoken to educators that went into the administrative section and they talk about the politics within there. I've spoken to professors that have gone, in the university. I guess the technical term is called the collegiate era, right? Or the collegiate level. But, I have professor friends and they're like, no, Luis, you don't understand the politics when you're trying to become a university professor or something like that. And then, and now you talk about journalism too, the politics, which I kind of understand journalism a little bit more, but I didn't realize how many politics were involved in so many aspects, of different career fields. And it's the
Yeah.
bad ones that are
There's-
that are running it, that are making it miserable for everyone else.
There's always people who want to be in charge and tell other people what to do.
Yes,
And
yes.
oftentimes,
Those are the people you got to watch out for.
They don't know what they're doing themselves.
Yeah, and when somebody goes around heralding people as an expert, so you have to listen to them, that's always something to watch out for
Yes.
too.
Same
There
thing
used
goes
to be
for- Same thing
Go
goes
ahead,
for psychology, by the way. I
everything.
I went into the field of psychology believing that this was supposed to be a field that celebrated interpersonal differences, human differences, true diversity, and I'm here to tell you, some of the most closed-minded and yes, controlling people have gone into this field, which is why I no longer have hair.
No, diversity means everybody is exactly the same no matter what.
Yeah, there you go.
That's what it's
Well-
become.
I
Well,
was going to tell you, there was a guy that wrote movie reviews at the Hartford Current, and every time he wrote a review of a movie that said this is just full of juvenile humor and unintelligent, I said, that's the movie I'm going to go
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
And that's the way I feel about experts.
Yeah.
You're an expert, then I got something else to do.
Yeah.
You know,
Uh,
that's a good thing about sitting at the back of the room as a vet, right? You can usually sit back and watch, and you can usually tell who's who just by
Isn't that the
what they're.
case? I'm so glad
Yeah.
you brought that up, Nate, because I do that, and I don't mean to be like looking down. It's just you're observing,
Right.
and
You're
like,
just observing.
Where the hell did this guy come from? Holy smoke!
Yeah.
You know?
People, it's the same person that scoots up as close to the boss as they can always get,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
it might be, you know, it might on the outside it's completely innocent in the appearance, but I'm like, oh, okay, now that ties into this other part of this personality I've seen.
You know, when I was at the Hartford Current in the 80s, in the late 70s when I was there, it was family owned. And around 1980, some big corporations started making overtures to buy it. And
Yeah.
a couple were turned down, and finally, the LA Times bought it. And people had based their entire careers on who they had kissed up to. And I could never get into that, you know, because in a lot of cases I didn't respect the people in the first place, and I just didn't like them. You know, I'm not gonna go drinking with you.
Hey, Ron.
Hey, which cult of personality do you belong to?
Hey, Ron,
I
let
like
me,
being
let
out
me
on the
ask you.
streets doing my job. And when the LA Times bought it out, for 1 year everything was just smooth, and then everybody in upper management got replaced almost simultaneously. And people were bouncing off of the walls, and it became a status symbol to who was going for counseling, you know, to who was going to go get therapy. And I was sitting there laughing at it because we changed commanding officers in the Marine Corps on average about once every 18 months and sometimes less. And what I learned there was he has his job and you have yours.
yeah.
Do your job. And as long as you do your job, the guy who gives you the pros and cons every 3 months is going to rate you on what you do,
Right.
not what the guy upstairs in the big office is doing. And they never understood that. I mean, people literally were going bonkers. And I just, my God, but they didn't have that foundation. They didn't have the foundation that the military gave us to see things in a bigger scope. And you know, well, I spent all these years doing this with him, and now he's out. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Why don't you try writing? Isn't that what you do for a job? Don't you write? How about writing something just so sparkling and overwhelming? They would go, wow! You know, they couldn't see that.
Yeah.
Too many of them couldn't
Yeah.
see it.
Hey, Ron. Do you ever the kind of suck up character that you're talking about? I happen to be a big fan of MASH, for better for worse, and what you're describing there is Frank Burns. Frank Burns to a T.
Oh, absolutely.
That character exists
Yeah.
for a reason, and people think, no, he's not really that bad. Well, the guy who played him, Larry Linville, said
Ooh, yeah.
Frank Burns is everywhere. Don't make him chairman of the board. Don't put him in a position of power. He acts without thinking.
Yeah.
You know, he goes for status. He's impulsive, and yet it was a comedic take on a real personality type, which is exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, always the smartest person in the room, right?
According
Now,
to
would
them.
that be the same as a narcissist?
That has a
Can y'all hear me?
narcissistic
Would that be the same
tendency
as a
about it,
narcissist?
but yeah, it's
tendency
well,
about it?
I'm not, I can't diagnose, but it is a
Right,
trait,
right.
you know, to try to come across as the big mouth, blowhard, know-it-all, and so on and so
Right.
forth. And the truly great ones are the ones who actually are very humble and say they'll be the first ones who say, "I don't know."
Yeah. And they won't be ashamed to take advice from somebody of a lower rank or lesser stature
Right.
who may
They-
have a different experience that helps you.
Yep.
Yeah.
You mean like lieutenants that listen to their staff NCOs?
Perfect.
Crazy idea.
You very well may be the smartest guy in the room with zero experience in this area. So, what were you going to make it up? You all of a sudden it's just going to come into you by osmosis. No, it doesn't work.
Yeah, the book told me.
Well,
So
to
what
that
is
end,
so
and this-
Nate? Because you were a Mustang, what is it to say that a staff NCO that becomes a lieutenant and still doesn't listen to their staff NCO?
There's a lot of them around, believe it or not.
I know. Trust me.
Yeah, they're usually the ones that you really never knew that they were prior enlisted,
True,
right?
very true.
They were more than happy to shed that because now they got the status on their collars.
The best pilots, the best young pilots that we had in 161 were former enlisted. We had a whole group of young lieutenants, and they were to a man, they were great guys.
Yeah.
Great, every
Oh,
single
nice.
one of them.
Yeah.
But there were a couple former enlisted, and they did stand out in their own ways.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not disparaging any of the other guys. It's just saying the guys that were former enlisted had some about them because they knew something.
Right.
They'd experienced something.
Yeah.
And I never did become a Mustang. I didn't take the commission at the end of the day because
Oh, okay.
I was all ready to go. And then November came and they passed the Foreign Assistance Act of 74 and abandoned Vietnam. And then January came and they invaded and started in small and kept me. And I kept, where are we going to be? Where's the Marine Corps? Where are the generals? And I was due to get commissioned on January 6th, I guess, was my graduation day. And April 30th came first, and I said, I explained it to my son one time, and I said, Kev, I said, number one, I would have had to leave you. I said they were going to send me down to Quantico again 6 months for basic school. Not too bad, but unaccompanied. I was very close to my son, still am after all these years, very close. I said, then they were going to send me to Okinawa for 18 months unaccompanied. And it was very hard on him. Those 11 weeks I was away for OCS, really hard on
Yeah.
the kid. And I didn't like that at all. And I said to him, no, I said, Kev, all I can see at this stage, I said, I couldn't see this when I was 18. It was a big adventure. I was going to be a Marine. And I'm not ever sorry and still proud that I did that. I said, but I can tell you right now, in the very near future, somebody's going to be up there in the Pentagon putting pins on a map. And I'm going to be at the end of that pin. Me knowing me, I'll be there. And after what they just did, no, I'm not going to do that. And I didn't. They weren't happy, but I didn't. And that is what it is. That's how I ended up in the world of journalism. Graduated, didn't really have a job, and so I was cutting firewood and working at a game club until Hartford Current looked for a stringer, and it turned out I was really good at that stuff.
Yeah. So, were you? What year did you start in journalism?
76.
76. Okay. So, where were you about? What were you? Were you still in journalism during Desert Storm?
Yeah. I went back. I wrote Masters of the Art in '86 and '87. Could not get it published. And I'll tell you another story, and then I'll get quick into Desert Storm. In '88, I got a call from an agent in New York City, and back then, you guys will appreciate this, when you send a manuscript out, it was a manuscript, that thick. I had a friend with a print shop in Middletown, Connecticut, and he did up probably about 12.5 copies for me, and I sent them to agents, and I sent them to printers, or publishers, and I just get reject after reject after reject. And then I got a phone call one day in my home in Connecticut, and this guy tells me he's an agent down in Manhattan, and my hopes all come up now all of a sudden. Well, somebody at least going to represent me, and he says, yeah, I just wanted to let you know there's no way in hell I'd ever represent you on a book like this. And I said, well, could you tell me why not? And he said, yeah. He said, it's full of lies. And I said, what are you talking about, lies? I said, I lived that. I said, I quoted everybody directly. I interviewed the people that I quoted. And for the people I didn't have, I went down to the archives in the Naval Yard in Washington, D.C., and I got the records. I said, everything in there. He goes, no, that's not what I'm talking about. He said, you make it look like you guys are a bunch of, happy-go-lucky, all-American Marines. You like your women, you like your beer, you believe in your country. And I said, yeah, what's wrong with that? He said, we all know you were a bunch of baby killers and murderers.
Wow.
Oh, and that was in '88?
That quote, guys, I'm not kidding you about it. I remembered that, as if you branded it in me. So
Wow.
I hummed around for a while, and then finally I went to a place called Carlton Press in New York City and self-published. And I got several thousand copies, and I actually talked to a guy, who ended up working over at Random House when they picked it up 15 years later, and he told me he had been at Carlton. He said, I remember that book because I did this big mail thing. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have email. I had postcards, but I had thousands because I've been meeting all these veterans, since 1982. So for the last 8 years, I've just been compiling this mailing list. So when the book was ready, I just flooded it. And they sold like 1,000 books, like right off the bat. Nobody did that. Usually it was just more like vanity stuff, but I was a professional writer, and I had other editors read it for me, and we did a pretty good job. There was a couple things I caught afterwards. You always do, but so we did really well. And then the rest of the books came to my house, and for the next 8-10 years, I schlepped that thing all over this country. I go to reunions and stuff, go out and speaking tours, and I take 50 books with me and sell them all. I went to bookstores. I never knew that, when they always do these big bookstore things, and like a big star goes there and the lines around the block to get their signature.
Yeah.
Well, when it isn't a big star, if they sell 5 or 6 books on an author appearance, they're doing really good. And I go into these private bookstores and I'd sell 50 books. I had no idea I was doing some great. I wasn't doing anywhere near as well as Elizabeth Taylor, and I'm thinking, geez, too bad. But anyway, I was going to tell you something else, and it just slipped my mind. You asked a question, I said, I'll tell you how I got there.
I was asking if you were doing journalism during Desert Storm.
Oh, that's what I meant. Yeah. So I took the book, Masters of the Art, over to the Journal-Inquirer in Connecticut. And the editor there was a former Marine, the editor for the living section, Rich Tambling, late Marine. Rich liked the book, said he's going to get it reviewed for me. While I was there, the managing editor, who I had never met, but I had butted heads with his reporters when I was a reporter at the Current, overlapping. He knew who I was by reputation. He heard I was in the building. He sent a guy down there and said, hey, Chris Powell would like to see you. So I went up to Chris's office, and we sat there and shot the breeze for like what I thought was going to be 10 minutes. Well, as it turns out, he needed an editor. So I went in as an editor at the JI, and I was there for that. And it turned out to be a tremendous marriage of minds because Chris is really, really interested. Now, Chris opposed the war in Vietnam. He thought, if you're not going to go over there and win it, I'm not going to go over there and get killed for you. And it was a pretty simple point of view, and I thought he was right about it, actually. Those of us there, people don't know another factoid. 66% of us in Vietnam were volunteers. 70% of the ones that died were volunteers. But anyway, Chris really liked having me on staff when things like this happened, like Desert Storm, because I could answer military questions that most other people there couldn't answer. And from Desert Storm on, where I got to be most effective as a journalist was in cutting through the fog of war, if you will, to explain things that happened, and also to catch the crap that the Associated Press was passing out because they didn't know what the hell they were talking about. And I even got to them one time. Do you remember when those Navy SEALs went ashore? I think it was over in Mogadishu, and they, everybody covered it. They came ashore and it was light there and all. Well, they called that the biggest amphibious operation since World War II. Looking at you, you're full of crap.
What?
It's not even close. What have you ever hear of Incheon? Okay, in the Korean War, in the amphib operation I was on down south of Chulai with the 26 Marines, much bigger than that, much bigger.
Yeah.
Well, I called them up. I said, "You guys are wrong. This is," and they literally twisted themselves into pretzels to find some way to say, well, technically we're accurate. No, you're not. It says it's the biggest amphibious operation since World War II. No, it's not. Correctly. And of course they wouldn't. But we didn't put it in our paper.
So, well, they're the AP.
Right.
Yes,
they're the experts.
And God knows they know more than anybody. They know everything there is to know about everything there is to know about.
Yep. And was that the one where Geraldo Rivera was covering it as well too? Or was that operation just cause?
He probably was, but the big one with him was when he was it Afghanistan? Or, I think it was Afghanistan.
It was Afghanistan or Iraq when he started drawing out the train plan.
Tell where everybody was. Thanks, Ronald.
I saw him doing that live. I was just like, are you kidding me? Nobody tackled him.
So
Yeah, that's some pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah. So you experienced that whole the way they were treating the press pool during the war and how they were controlling the photos and stuff. It was. Do you think? This has been my personal my opinion on it, but I think that the way they did that had everything to do with all those. The Desert Storm generals were all the Vietnam lieutenants, and it's always been my idea that that's what they were trying to do, was trying to control the press so they didn't end up with a lot of the same.
Well,
Do you think how much of that would have been true?
You're right about that, and I think it was the right thing to do as well. And frankly, if you could get a journalist like Joe Galloway that did such a great job the Drang Valley with the 7th Cavalry, I mean, yeah, he was a great journalist. I mean, he didn't go out there but he didn't go out there with an agenda. I mean, the Army ended up giving him a Bronze Star for some of the stuff that he did.
I was going to say that name sounds familiar.
It's like the first true embed, right?
Yeah, actually, he was in the Mel Gibson movie We Were Soldiers.
That's right. That's right.
Oh.
In Vietnam.
He's the one smoking the cigarette, and they they hang like the camera on the tree limb for a while he's helping, and then he picks it back up and takes more pictures.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. But there's just too many of them that have an agenda, number one, and they're self-aggrandizement. I mean, they got people out there that, I've been here and I've been shelled and I've been bombed, and so what? The kid next door did that too. He didn't get anything special. Why should you? You got a job to do. I'm pretty disdainful of those people. That's probably a character flaw on my part, but frankly, I'm too old to care.
Yeah, I've seen a pretty good. There's a pretty good clip from. He was a journalist. I think he was embedded in Afghanistan, and he talks. What he does is he kind of advocates for veterans PTSD, but his story I thought was interesting, and I wish I could remember his name offhand. We will put it in the comments later. But so he had realized that he was having a little bit of PTSD from what he went through when he's with these guys because he got to know them. But he doesn't take that story and go around to talk about himself. He uses it as his eye-opening moment that made him realize how hard it is for some vets to come back home. And he was talking about that, and I thought it was interesting because I don't think I've ever seen a reporter talk about what they went through in order to amplify what the veterans went through. And it's
I think
really interesting.
That the reunions we do has been a really, for lack of a better word, a calming influence on a lot of our guys, because we were very tight as a unit, and we lost a lot of guys. And we did a lot of really good things, and we really got slapped in the face for it when we came home.
Yeah.
And I write in Masters of the Art, a couple nights after I got home, I went out to a combination restaurant, bar up the road from my house a few miles, and they had entertainment there on the weekends. And I was sitting there, and my at that time my fiance and my sister were there, and I'm looking over this way, and some punk with a Ho Chi Minh beard and love beads and a peace sign sneaks up and sucker punches me. And that was kind of like, if it had been later, I probably would have thought of it more. But to me, it was just a bar fight, because I had a glass of beer in my hand and I shattered it in his face, and he ran out the door, and I was laughing because his punch was so weak. There was a wall right behind my head. My head didn't hit the wall, and he didn't even leave a bruise. And I was like, what a pansy,
Probably had other Marines hit you harder than that.
Many times, down in Jacksonville, that was a weekly occurrence, and the guys in the infantry didn't mess around, man. They're going to punch you. They're going to hit you hard.
Oh yeah.
But, and the symbolism of it much later was obvious, but at that time, it was just kind of, God, you're stupid. That's what, and yet, you look at it, and that's what came of it. And I honestly think that, and I've heard at the reunions from the guys, everybody had similar responses. Everybody had things like that to deal with. Everybody had good times. Everybody had times that were really rough. And for the most part, I believe that our being together has enabled us to overcome a lot of that. Because I'll call somebody once in a while and say, you know, and they say, oh yeah, I was talking to Tom, and then I was talking to Jerry, you know, and I was talking to Anselmo, and I was like, wow, okay, so you guys are all talking to each other. And there's been hard times for a lot of our guys. Life is not a bowl of cherries, for lack of a better expression.
Yeah.
And it's been hard, and we've lost a couple. One of my very, very, very best friends in HMN 161 committed suicide. Well, it's over 20 years, almost 30 years ago now. And, you know, that was awful. That was just shattering. And especially because I talked to him about 2 weeks earlier and he had no clue, none whatsoever, that this guy was thinking of anything like that. And I was so devastated. I wrote an op-ed article for it, the JI. It was another great thing about Chris Paul. Boy, he always let me and Betty Ellis was the publisher and owner. They were so good to me. And they let me write about it. And because of that, I got a call from a lady whose maiden name was Winter. And she was on the town council in one of the cities that we covered. I never knew she had the same last name because she was married and had a different name. And she told me her brother was a Vietnam vet who had committed suicide. And she stayed on the phone with an hour for me and explained all the things that she had learned by going to counseling because she felt the same sense of guilt that I felt. Like, what did I do wrong? Why couldn't I have intervened? Why didn't I see this? And she was just, Ron, it wasn't your fault at all. If you weren't trained to recognize that, you just wouldn't be able to see it coming. Which kind of going back around full circle to what we were talking about earlier tonight about the veteran suicide and that. And I'll just say this, I know we're getting close to the end here, but I still believe the vast majority of veteran suicides are coming not because of bullying and not because of all this other, you know, stuff that they're trying to say because everybody's minds are so weak. I believe it has to do with the drugs that the VA and the military, active military, are giving our people while they're on active duty, then discharging them into the VA, and they're getting these drugs, and those drugs too often have as a side effect suicidal thoughts and tendencies.
To that end, let me jump in here.
Well,
Yeah, I'll start watching for that.
Yeah,
Many guys
what
many guys have said to me they go to the VA and they or and they just start throwing pills at them, and so many have said to me,
Yeah.
I don't want pills. I want somebody to listen to me, which is what I do all day long for these guys, or I try to. That's all I got. And we better pack it in because Luis has to get flying out the
I
door.
have said many times, I strongly advocate, and nobody wants to pick up on it, I believe there should be a reverse boot camp for people coming out of combat.
Oh,
I
definitely.
believe they should send at least a month winding down, getting used. You know, this is funny, and people think it was horrible. My son has a phenomenal sense of humor. I mean, this kid but it's out there. He likes the Far Side, okay? That's where his sense of humor. He liked Calvin and Hobbes. He wished he'd learned to read that stuff when he was much younger so he could have done it too. He used to take like a stack of books when he came home from school, and he'd see me like looking at the mail and all, and he'd go, pow, drop them on the floor. You know, and some people, oh man, that must have been awful, you know. No, actually what that did was reacclimate me. Because I knew darn well he's back there pulling some kind of nonsense. And I didn't think it was a mortar coming in. I thought it was my son back there being a jackwagon, and I was going to get him in a minute for doing that. You know, but it actually, that sense of humor helped me in many, many ways by doing little things like that. He was that kind of kid, and he's that kind of an adult, you know. And I think that kind of thing, if we could reacclimate the veterans, we spend all this money to take people out of civilian life and prepare them for the military, but we don't do anything to take them out of the military and prepare them back for civilian life.
That is perfect, Ron, because so Doc Berry and I met somebody. I don't want to go too deep into it, but take a look at a filmmaker named Frederick Marks, and he's got a film series called Veterans Journey Home. And it's all about rites of passages to come back to civilian life. And that's a film that is just not getting enough attention, and it really deserves so much more. They were going to play it at Quantico, and they canceled on him.
Why?
I'm not sure exactly what the reason was. I don't. Maybe they didn't know what they were signing up for, and then maybe somebody saw it later on, and but
Political correct.
I don't know.
Somebody was worried that somebody might be offended.
Right.
It
One thing
wouldn't surprise me.
One thing talking about veterans and suicide that I do want to dig into, that actually my other nonprofits digging into as well right now actually, is I don't know how it was for the Vietnam era or like the Desert Storm or Operation Just Cause or Somalia era service members, but I know for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, out of all the suicides, of the veteran suicide from the Afghanistan and Iraq war, over 48% of those are from people that have not deployed. So yeah, I mean, you think about that number, right? Like, why is it more non-deployed veterans committing suicide than it is deployed veterans committing suicide? It's almost double. It's almost 50% more.
You don't see
of
that
non-deployed.
in the media, Bruce.
No, so over 50% more of non-deployed veterans are committing suicide than deployed veterans. So it's why?
Well, there's one more.
You would
There's another aspect in there too. Is
you would think it'd be
the
different.
veterans today? The majority of the veterans, I know it's over half of the veterans that are committing suicide every day right now, are still Vietnam veterans.
Oh, is it? Oh, wow.
It is, but that doesn't mean that your number is wrong. I mean,
That's what I
so
said for our
that would
era.
mean the portion. Yeah, the portion of them that are from your era, half of those didn't deploy.
Right, over
So
half of them,
it's
yeah.
still interesting.
Yeah, so
Man.
Well, you know,
But-
to go right back with you on that, though, Nate, that we're back again to the VA because in my earlier years, I go to the VA for a yearly physical now, and I've got a couple of health issues I have to deal with because I'm older. But back
Yeah.
then, all up until about, I guess, 10, 12 years ago, I never went to the VA. And now there's a lot of guys like me, that never went earlier, and now they are. But ask how many of them are getting pills, because I can tell you, one time for something totally unrelated, I had a traffic accident. A drunk driver hit my wife and I up in Connecticut about, I think it was 10, 11 years ago. My hips got injured because I slammed into the dashboard, and I lost feeling in my leg. They sent me to the neurological thing, and the guy wanted to give me some pills that they were they were off label. In other words, they weren't specifically for that, but they were like experimental. They'd shown promise for nerve regeneration, and I argued with this man for 45 minutes, telling me we went down his damn pills, and he kept at me, and I said, fine, give me your pills. What are the side effects? He said, oh, you might get a little sleepy or something. So 2 weeks later, the pills come to my house, and I look down on the list of contraindications, and the first one is suicidal thoughts and tendencies.
Yeah.
Weight gain, which I'm trying to beat off all the time, and outbursts of rage. And I'm like, are you serious? So I took and dumped them down the toilet. Screw you on that.
Yeah.
but gentlemen, I
that
hate
was
to.
something that wasn't even related.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I do hate to have to rush off. I actually have a team out right now looking for a veteran in that crisis that I kind of have to get back to, and it looks like we're really close to finding him in Las Vegas. So, like I said, I really do hate to rush off. And gentlemen, as soon as this is done, just send me a text, and then I'll make sure everything's good to go to download it. Ronald, it was
Good to
such
go,
a
man.
pleasure meeting you and
Yes.
getting to hear your story. I hope we definitely do get to have you back again soon.
Yeah,
Available,
definitely.
guys.
Beautiful.
Sounds
Take
good.
care.
Which is what everybody says.
All right.
They all want to
Bye-bye.
come back. All right. Good night, all.